And welcome back to Coaching with the Bible. This week, the Torah reading Shmini on making mistakes and owning them. So we're back after a short hiatus, 1 week break for the holiday. I know you all missed your dose of Coaching with the Bible over the last couple of weeks, but we're back and excited to take our shots at the second half of the 5 books of Moses. Because in this week's portion, we get to the middle of the Torah, the middle of the 5 books. And I wanted to jump in on a topic which I wanted to actually discuss a couple of weeks ago, but in discussing the beginning of Leviticus and the idea of intentionality, that sort of overwhelmed the other topic, which is this one with respect to dealing with mistakes and making mistakes and owning mistakes. In the context of this week's Torah reading, so we have what should have been the climactic moment of the inauguration of the tabernacle, the Mishkan, in the desert. It's an exalted moment. It's an incredible moment. The Bible describes it in quite great beauty, the gathering of the entire nation, the idea that the presence of God rests upon that tabernacle, because it's an enjoyable, exalted, holy, special moment for no other reason, meaning not to teach and not to bring some sort of law or judgment down on the people, not to interact with Moses specifically at the moment, but because out of, let's call it, the joy of the moment, God's presence rests. And in the aftermath of that resting, or as a result of that presence, the 2 sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, make a mistake. And they bring something as an offering that was not commanded, and they're killed. That's not the mistake that I want to focus in on today. I want to focus in on the mistake that comes later in the aftermath of their death and in the interplay between Moses and Aaron thereafter. The Bible has a couple of moments where Moses and Aaron have what one might call tension after the sin of the golden calf here. Later on in the book of Numbers, when Aaron and Miriam are speaking ill of Moses. At the same time that the Bible has very high moments for Moses and Aaron. At the beginning of the book of Exodus, where Aaron is thrilled that Moses is chosen to be the leader and that he's going to be his number 2. In the entire course of the work of bringing the people out of Egypt, they're an incredible twosome, an incredible pair of brothers, and the Bible is replete with examples, certainly in the book of Genesis, of brothers and the relationships between brothers. And so here we have a tense moment. Moses tries to comfort Aaron. Aaron is silent. Then Moses gets angry. And this is the part that we want to focus in on. In the aftermath of the death of these 2 sons of Aaron and what happens next, Moses focuses in on going forward on the work that is to be done or that should have been done, and holds the other priests responsible for not having completed the work. Aaron replies, Moses replies, Aaron replies, and then it ends. And it ends in a very interesting way. After the technical part of it, which is not the focus here, the technical part of what they're discussing, which is interesting in its own right as to what Moses was focusing in on in terms of an immediate offering, what Aaron is focusing in on with respect to things that are happening in the long term, and then how that plays out from a technical, legal, Jewish law perspective is interesting, but not the focus. The focus here is the end. The Bible tells us at the end of the 10th chapter that after Aaron spoke for the last time, and he says to Moses as follows. This day we have offered up these offerings before God, and this has befallen me, the loss of my 2 sons. And if I had eaten the sin offering today, would it have been pleasing in the eyes of God? Moses heard that, it was pleasing in his sight. That's the the simple translation, or the translation itself. Moses hears it in verse 20, and it was good in his eyes. It's a very interesting thing. So Moses is angry. The Bible tells us directly that he's angry at them. Then there's the response here, and Aaron either placates Moses, convinces Moses, replies to Moses that it doesn't make sense. Rabbi Sachs, in a beautiful article in Volume 3 of Covenant and Conversation, discusses that back and forth as to what's going on there and what each is focusing in on and what the understanding of the learning can be from their conversation back and forth. And it is beautiful. It could be on a technical, legal level. It could be on a moral level that they're arguing or disagreeing. And it's really interesting. What I want to share with you, though, is an additional point, which is brought about in a comment in the works of Nechama Leibowitz, who I think we mentioned once in the course of our work so far, and we should mention her more. Her studies in the 5 books of Moses are a masterwork and wonderful and beautiful and powerful and usable and teachable and learnable and all those different things. And she quotes here a very powerful comment in the Midrash on those last words with respect to Moses, that it says that it was good in his eyes. But it's not simply that it was good in his eyes. Rashi comments there that Moses acknowledges that he didn't know, and he wasn't embarrassed to admit, I didn't know that law. I didn't hear that law. But she goes further. In quoting the Midrash, this Midrashic statement, this exegetical statement says as follows. Moses issued a proclamation to the entire camp, stating, I made a mistake with the law, and my brother Aaron came and put me right. It's a public proclamation on a mistake in judgment on the law that Moses is admitting to the world. Now that's powerful business. Because until that point, we have other situations where Moses overreacts, he speaks ill of the people, whatever you want to call it. But here he's freely admitting his mistake, his mistake in judgment, his admitting the guilt or the flaw in his logic, in his thinking, and that's powerful business. The Netziv, Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, in his work, Ha'emek Davar, it's a beautiful commentary on the 5 books of Moses, in a comment to his own comment, mentions this Midrashic statement that we just mentioned, and he adds the idea that this is a lesson for all teachers for all time, that they shouldn't be so big as to never admit their own mistakes. Moses wasn't so big to not admit his mistakes, so no teacher at any point, at any time in history, should be hesitant or unwilling to admit their mistakes. And so the power of the mistake, or the admittance and the ownership of the mistake, is crucially important. If Moses could do it, so could we. In a separate article that Rabbi Sachs issued a couple of weeks ago, that was issued by the office of Rabbi Sachs, and it appears in Covenant Conversation on the sin of the leader, the idea that the Bible tells us that the leader, when the leader sins, not if the leader sins, because it's going to happen that the leader will sin, and that blessed is the generation who has leaders who will admit to their sins. And so we exist at a time when there's so many things happening and so many decisions that people are making for good and for bad, under circumstances that are unclear and ambiguous and new and unique. And people make mistakes in judgment, mistakes in decisions, react poorly, emotionally, inappropriately in certain circumstances. And the other part of it, with respect to the forgiveness of it, is a conversation that we should have at another point. But as leaders in our homes, as leaders in our relationships, as leaders on our teams at work, whether we're partners, owners, we talk about them all the time, we're sure to come across situations where we make mistakes. And so the question becomes, when we make those mistakes as leaders, what do we do with them? How do we react to our mistakes? Are we consistent in the manner in which we react to our mistakes, our own mistakes, as we are to the mistakes that others on our teams make? Do we hold them accountable differently than the way in which we hold ourselves accountable? It's important to devise a culture and an environment in our worlds, work worlds, home worlds, where mistakes are possible. I remember years ago we were at someone's table on for a Shabbat meal, and they had this tradition that the children could go around the table and admit to something that they did wrong that week without judgment. It's fascinating custom, but it fostered a very open and comfortable environment to appreciate that we all make mistakes, we all fail, right? Failure would be sort of an extended version of making a mistake, but we learn from our failures. The most obvious one, they always talk about it, is when children learn to walk. They learn to walk by falling down. Falling down, quote unquote, is the mistake or the error, but you learn to actually keep your steps and walk and then run ultimately because you've learned from what you've done wrong before. And so the mistakes become part of the success, become part of the victory, become valuable. I recently heard an interview with Danny Kahneman, the author of Thinking Fast and Slow, Nobel Prize winner, where he takes great pleasure in being shown his mistakes, and that he sort of lights up, is the description, when he is shown to have erred in his judgment, in his thinking, in his logic, in his research even, or in his hypothesis. And that may be an extreme version of it, but it's something to sort of think about and understand. And recently reading a lot about sort of the review of the last year in the pandemic environment, in the work environment, and how leaders handled themselves, how their mind was thinking in the course of the beginning of this, and how they sort of evolved over the course of time, and how they realized that some of the things that they had thought at the beginning, or what they were leaning in on and thinking about and doing and focusing in on, were in fact mistaken, that they should have thought differently about what they were focused in on, what was important. One particularly that I saw was a very interesting article in the Financial Times, where it was a roundtable on the value of mistakes from CEOs of companies, and one particular focused in on the idea that she was heavily focused in on revenue, which is understandable, that making sure that the company continued to have day-to-day, month-to-month revenue so that they could stay alive, but she sort of neglected, at least the way I understood it, neglected the emotional component of an incredibly difficult situation, and really going in on the human part of this rather than the financial part of it should have been something of her focus at the beginning. She obviously corrected and course corrected going forward. And so ultimately where we get to with this is an appreciation that we all make mistakes, we all err in our judgment. That famous thing, to err is human, to forgive is divine. Again, the forgiveness at another time. So then what happens here? What are we supposed to do when we make a mistake? So there's another great article by Jim Whitehurst, who is now the CEO of IBM, who at the time was chairman and CEO of another company, Red Hatter. And he tells a story in the article, it's from 2015, where he made a decision on software that was a mistake. He made the wrong decision on the software. It set them back many, many months, a lot of money. And what did he do? He admitted it in front of the entire team that he had made the mistake. He told the board of directors that he had made this mistake, that it was going to set them back. He owned his mistake. Subsequently, he explained it, meaning the first step with respect to mistakes or errors in judgment is to own them and to admit them and to be accountable for them. Right? We talked in the first Coaching with the Bible, and we talked about Adam and accountability. So his lack of accountability and other people having accountability, that's the key thing with fault, is admitting it, owning it at the outset, before explaining it. No excuses, just I own it, I made a mistake, I'm sorry, stop, period. After that comes the learning. So the learning comes from an explanation, it comes from review, it comes from peer review even further, it comes from an assessment of what was, key learnings, so that going forward the mistake doesn't happen again. So there is that really key process in learning from the mistakes that are made that can be implemented, that can be part of a company culture, that can be normalized as part of what happens. Obviously, if it's egregious and it's terrible and it's regular, so there's a deeper issue at play here, and that needs further exploration. But specifically speaking, the first thing, after having made the mistake and having been made aware of the mistake, is an open admittance of having made the mistake, an ownership of that mistake first. Then there can be a request for forgiveness if that's necessary, but then there is the explanation period. There's a phase of explaining, well, why did that mistake happen? What was the logic behind that decision? Then is a sort of an action plan so that it doesn't happen again. So the key learnings and then the action items that can go in. And then obviously there is ultimately sort of the test situation where it comes up again at some point later and the mistake isn't made. This is how, we appreciate that we make mistakes and how we learn from our mistakes and how we become better into the future. No different than the little child learning to walk, no different from the kid who's trying to hit a baseball or to do something else or to write a sentence. They make a mistake, mispronounce a word, small little things, but also as they grow. And so hopefully, we remain on the side where we have very minor mistakes and very minor errors in our judgment. And so they don't have far-reaching long-term impact, for years and years and years. But those things happen because, as the Bible said it, it's not if the leader will make the mistake, it's when the leader will make the mistake. And then ultimately, what does the leader do in the aftermath of the mistake? So what we've taken from here is Moses openly, freely admitting to making an error, not knowing and making an error, his brother teaching him, Moses publicly acknowledging it to the world, and obviously then for us, the notion of accepting, being accountable and owning our mistakes, learning from those mistakes, admitting to those mistakes, and then going forward and being better and not having to rest on or carry the burden, the yoke of that mistake forever and ever. Okay, so that's Coaching with the Bible for this week. Hope you have a wonderful weekend. Those of you celebrating, Shabbat Shalom.